I think for many therapists, we hear the word business or marketing and we think like it's this thing that we don't know enough about, or it's about tactics or funnels or any of these things, particularly because, again, most of us have not taken business or marketing classes. So we gravitate and we hear this language and we're like, okay, I guess I should do this or do that. But I actually feel like therapists are the one of the best people at business because we value authenticity, relationships, and all of these things. Success of a business, it all comes down to one-to-one relationships.
This is Heard Business School, where we sit down with private practice owners and industry experts to learn about the business of therapy together. I'm your host, Michael Fulwiler. Therapists wield a profound understanding of the human connection, which is a cornerstone of their healing art, but it's also the essence of a prosperous business. My guest on this episode of Heard Business School is Dr. Melvin Varghese. If you've met him or listened to his podcast, Selling the Couch, you'll know his voice feels like a warm hug. He's kind, generous, and overall just a wonderful human being. Melvin, or as many know him, Mel, is a licensed psychologist, a dedicated father and husband, a podcaster, course creator, and the founder and CEO of Selling the Couch. In his private practice, he excels at helping founders of color, VC-backed founders, and founder dads to manage the anxiety, depression, and burnout that often accompany business growth. During our conversation, Melvin delves into several key topics: the intrinsic value therapists bring to business through their focus on authenticity and relationships, his journey from clinical work to creating and scaling Selling the Couch to over 1 million downloads, and the evolution of his podcasting program, Healthcasters. He also opens up about the financial struggles and imposter syndrome he faced early on, transitioning from clinical work to online business, and the burnout experience due to over-diversification. It's a conversation that balances professional ambition with authenticity and the importance of providing real value to one's community. So, without further ado, let's dive into my conversation with Dr. Melvin Varghese. Enjoy. Melvin, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Mike, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm incredibly honored to be here and excited for you guys and everything that you're doing at Heard.
How does it feel to be on the other side of the podcast, Mike?
A little bit strange. I'm getting used to it since I am doing more guesting on podcasts, but it still feels weird. It gives me an appreciation of what a guest must go through as I think about questions or pause or any of those things.
Well, we have so much to cover to dig into your entrepreneurial journey as a therapist. I'm really excited for this conversation. I'd love to start at the beginning. So your parents, they immigrated with your family to the US in the 80s. What was that experience like for you? And how did it ultimately put you on a path to becoming a therapist?
Man, that's a really great question. This might be maybe it's a multi-episode, but I'll keep it short. Yeah, so I was born in the early 80s and my parents had the opportunity to come to the US a couple of times, and they decided to stay in India mainly because my dad is an attorney, my mom was a nurse. We're in their late 20s, early 30s at that point, and had family around and careers and all of that. And basically, in the late 80s, the US immigration department was basically like, this is your last opportunity to get a green card if you want to come to the US. So that was one factor. And then the other factor is I have a younger brother, and my parents, I think they saw something, and namely in the realm of education, that there might be more educational opportunities and career opportunities. And I translate to that almost like stability at a different level if they did immigrate. So we immigrated. I grew up in various suburbs of Dallas. So we immigrated to Texas because we had most of our family there. And English is actually my second language, so I didn't speak it at all. In fact, in second grade when we came, that whole first year I spent in English as a second language classes, just trying to adjust. What drove me ultimately to become a therapist, one thing I realized is, especially as a South Asian immigrant, there's often this stereotype, which is kind of true and not true, but it's basically like our career options are doctor, lawyer, engineer, or failure, right? That's the four kind of options. And so I was very set on going into medicine to go into pediatrics because I love kids. And then I hit undergrad, went to a great liberal arts school that was a feeder for a lot of the medical schools in Texas and Oklahoma and all of that. Really struggled academically and went through a bout of intense depression, had very intense suicidal thoughts. And I told my parents they had the foresight for me to see a psychologist. At that point, I was also basically went on academic probation, was going to lose like 90% of my scholarship at this liberal arts school that in 2000 was like 30 grand a year. I looked the other day and it was like 45 grand now. And I saw this psychologist, and just over the course of months, just these conversations, the depression seemed to lift. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, this is a career. And I also began to wonder how many people, especially immigrants of color, struggle with this aspect of it, right? The pressure of leaving a country, of having to achieve, and what if you don't follow the prescribed path?
Did you major in psychology as an undergrad?
I did. I did.
Okay.
I initially went in pre-med and was a psychology major. And then after second semester of OChem, I dropped OChem at like halfway through my second semester. And then I just went full psychology all the way through.
And then did you go straight into grad school after undergrad?
Yeah, right after undergrad, I think something clicked from that second semester, sophomore year to junior to senior year. And so I was very fortunate to do well academically and then got directly into a PhD program right out of undergrad. So yeah, so that was the path.
Oh, wow. So you did your master's and PhD as part of the same program?
Yeah, so they call it like a master's in passing. So I did like a master's, I forgot they called it like a thesis, but it was like an abbreviated thesis. And so, yeah.
Did you do clinical work while you were in school? Like, did you have an internship as part of your PhD program?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I went to a PhD program that was, APA accredited. So I think even from, I want to say second year on and possibly third year, I did basically practicums throughout the rest of like that time. So I primarily worked in university counseling centers. I also worked at a community mental health agency where they like specialized in, well, I did assessments there. I worked at another agency that did family therapy. So, but they had like one way mirrors and that whole, like all of that stuff, which was incredibly awesome from a training perspective. And then, yeah, and then eventually for internship and postdoc, I, matched at Vandy, and that was a kind of a joint internship and postdoc. So basically, my primary rotation was at the University Counseling Center, the Vanderbilt campus, and which that was a phenomenal experience because it's one of the most stressful campuses in the nation just because of the number of high achievers, and just I learned so much there. And then my secondary rotation was at the VA, so I worked in the polytrauma clinic, so TBIs and PTSD.
Was private practice on your mind when you were in graduate school? Was that kind of the end goal, or were you still just exploring your options and seeing in what setting you wanted to work in?
Yeah, private practice full time was actually never the goal. The plan was actually to become a university counseling center director and then do part time teaching and part time private practice.
Was there something about going into private practice full time that felt intimidating, or were there certain barriers to kind of taking that jump?
Yeah, so I think like even before the private practice side of it, the thing that intimidated me the most is I had never taken a business or marketing class, like in undergrad, high school, like nothing, grad school, nothing. Again, I think part of it was I do feel like it's my natural gifting, but I just didn't know it, at the time because I was like very much on this like pre-med and then psychology track, right? And so I think what definitely that thought that I don't know stuff definitely put a lot of fear in me. And even as I now go back into private practice, it doesn't feel as big now because I've done Sci on the Couch for 9 years now. But it definitely, that fear of like, what if I mess this up? What if there's some marketing or some method that I don't know about because I didn't like learn it that's going to impact my ability to be successful as a business owner?
I'm so glad you said that. I think that's such a common experience for therapists, right? That you go to graduate school to become a therapist, you don't take a business class. And then if you want to start your own practice, now you're a business owner, right? And it is really scary. And it's really the entire thesis for this show, right? Is that most therapists don't go to business school, and so our goal with this show is really, talking to folks like yourself and, helping to share what you've learned over the years. You said a couple of things there that I definitely want to unpack. You mentioned you started selling the couch. So that happened around 2015, right? So can you talk about that? And I know we've talked about like you were sitting down, you were talking with a lot of therapists, you were interviewing them, you were trying to learn as much as you can. And at one point you were like, I should be sharing this information with other people.
Yeah, that's the condensed version of it. So I got licensed in as a psychologist in 2012. After I finished up my postdoc, we moved to Philadelphia. My partner and I got married. We moved to Philadelphia just to be closer to family. I had zero social like or professional network, anything like that at all. I started in a group practice, and then I was working at a community mental health agency doing testing and assessment. And then at the group practice, I was also doing therapy and bariatric surgery evals. And so when I had two friends that were at that group practice and we just connected, had, noticed we had a lot of common interests. We all had this desire to start a small business at some level, whether that was private practice. I mean, I think for all of us at some point it was private practice, but we would meet at my friend Mike's apartment in Manioc, which is like, this section of Philly, and we would watch a YouTube video or we would read out of, like one of those like private practice books, right? Like Lynn Grotzky's book, right? And read out of it and then like talk about it. And then we would go get like barbecue or something, it's just like a fun learn thing. And over time, I just started noticing inside of me, like, I was like, oh, I'm really interested in this like business stuff. I'm also interested in how we can use like our clinical skills beyond just doing therapy or testing. Like, what would that look like? For example, if you wrote a book or created a course or launched a podcast or something like that. And the other question, which is what you alluded to, I had this thought. I wonder if there are other therapists that would love to be in on these conversations. And this was again in 2015, like a lot of podcasts were like, I don't even think most people knew what a podcast was. And I reached out to some local therapists just out of the blue. And I was like, hey, my name is Melvin. I'm a licensed psychologist. I'm doing this thing called a podcast. I want to interview you because it seems like you've built a successful practice or a successful business. Can we like talk? And so I'm pretty sure the first conversations were over Zoom. And one of my friends who's a sports psychologist, Corey, I remember reaching out to Corey and he was like, to me, it felt like a celebrity because he had been like on like Fox and a couple of these like, TV kind of things. He was like doing sports psychology and teaching and all this stuff. And he's like, why don't I just come over to your house? And I was like, oh, okay. And so he comes over and he's like, maybe we can just record the podcast there. And he later told me he had walking pneumonia that day, but he just like still wanted to show up. I literally took an ironing board. I put my $60 podcast mic right in the middle of this ironing board. And I told Corey, hey, I'm going to record this, but I only have one mic. So I'm just going to prompt you. So when I prompt you, you speak into the mic and then I'll pull back and then I'll ask the question and then prompt you. So that's how we recorded that episode.
That's amazing. And what a gift. You could have had these conversations, you could have kept them to yourself, but you decided to record them and share them with other people. And it's been almost 10 years now, right, that you've been doing this podcast. And I remember I was working at the Gottman Institute at the time. I started there in 2012 and like selling the couch. That was like the podcast at the time for therapists. And so you've really been doing this for a while now.
Wow, I didn't know that part. I
Yeah,
didn't even know. Wow, that's incredibly, it's humbling. The thing I've most enjoyed about it is just getting to meet amazing people. And for therapists, I mean, there's just something so empowering when we can share our own stories about the things that worked and didn't work for us. And I don't know, I'm a big believer in that concept of a rising tide lifts all boats, and I feel like podcasting is like one of the best ways to do that.
absolutely. So you start this podcast on an ironing board with one microphone.
Uh-huh.
At some point, you make the decision. I'm going to go all in on this. This is going to be my full time thing. I'm going to leave clinical work. I'm going to build this business online. Can you talk about that process and what that was like?
Yeah, of course. Well, I call that my like overnight process that actually took 5.5 years.
Right.
So
Your overnight success, right?
yes,
Yeah.
yes. So yeah, from 2015 to just when right before the pandemic, actually that March of when the pandemic started, selling the couch was essentially from 2015 to about 2017, I was recording episodes basically around clinical work. So I mean, to be completely honest, Mike, the first several months, I got up at like 3:50 in the morning to record solo episodes, and then I would take the train to Center City, Philadelphia. I'd take the 7:30 train, and then I would go see like a day of clients, and then come back, and then like write up show notes or anything else I needed to tweak. And then over time, I knew in the first like 3.5 weeks, the podcast became like an Apple new and noteworthy podcast. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. There's like a need for this in a way that I didn't imagine. And then I started thinking, like, what would this look like if it became a full time thing? Right. And I didn't have sponsors or anything. So I had to figure out a way to like make money from it. So I launched a podcasting course for therapists because colleagues were reaching out to me, basically asking, like, how did you do this podcasting thing? I was doing one-on-one consults and I was like, I got to figure out a better way to like deliver this and scale it. In 2015, going to 2016, there was a nor'easter that hit the Northeast. I dumped like almost 30 inches of snow. I'm sure you remember this. I ended up having to like telehealth was not a thing. And even then, like there were down power lines and all this stuff in this area. So I ended up having to cancel 22 fee for service clients. And it was about $950 in income that week. And we were saving up for the down payment on our first home. So, and I was like, oh my gosh, like I can't build an entire business where it's dependent on me or clients showing up. Like I love the work, but from a business perspective, it just didn't seem wise. And then in 2018, our daughter was born 2 months early. We had gone through a year of infertility the year before, and every like test and everything was perfectly normal. And then she came 2 months early, and I realized she was 3 pounds, 12 ounces, barely the size of a football. And I realized in that moment, I had to make this thing work because she ended up needing almost a year and a half of early childhood intervention due to low muscle tone in her back. So she wasn't sitting up at the age she was supposed to. And so that's what really prompted me to make this like a full-time thing. What would it look like? And essentially, what I wanted to do was I wanted clinical work to go from clinical work being my main source of income to more scalable income sources, and then to go back into clinical work, but then pick and choose how many clients I wanted to see, what I wanted to charge, all of that kind of stuff.
What were some of the challenges early on as you were forming and trying to build this business to be something sustainable, that you could live on?
The biggest one I think was I had a lot of money stuff, like money stuff that I just had to work through. I think as a person of color, I think one, as an immigrant, I literally, there were stories that I had to work through. I had a undergrad experimental psych professor who I sort of saw as like a pseudo mentor when I had approached them about going into psychology versus not medicine anymore. They basically said, you're never going to make any money as a psychologist. And when you're 18 or 19 years old, right, it just derailed me. And I had to work through a lot of that narratives because in the back of my mind is like, you're going to mess it up. You're going to, you're not going to make any money on any of that kind of stuff. So that was definitely a big one. I mean, we call it imposter syndrome, but like, I feel like there's so many nuances to that term. And for me, I was an early career psychologist, like interviewing people that were 15, 20, 25, 30 years into the field. And like, I'm kind of starstruck while simultaneously like interviewing them and trying to like
Yeah.
keep a straight face. So I think that was definitely the other side of it. And I mean, the final one I think was focus. And I actually made mistakes, which is I kept thinking, if you're going to go from this like clinical realm to this online business, like you have to have a large reach online. The piece I didn't understand was it doesn't mean you go and diversify like yesterday, right? So I went podcasts, I created a Facebook group, I tried Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, like all simultaneously. And as a solopreneur, like I had no help, right? And so that was a formula for burnout. So that's something I always tell our colleagues, like when you're starting anything new, like year one is learning, year two is like earning, and year three and beyond is scaling. That's a phrase from Ramit Sethi. So I want to give him credit for that. But I just thought that's such a good framework because I think a lot of therapists want to go into like year two mindset or year three, but we're often just at year one.
Yeah, there's a couple points there that I think are important. I want to reiterate. You mentioned you launched the podcast, and within like 2 weeks, it was like a featured podcast, right, on Apple Podcasts. And so Seth Godin talks about this idea of the dip, where like when you launch something new, there's like some initial success. You haven't put in a lot of effort yet, but you're seeing good results. And then there's like this dip back down, right? And in that dip, that's when a lot of people quit, right? They're like, this isn't working, but it's really about continuing to invest effort over time. And this idea of like compounding effort, right? That could you talk about that a little bit and like, thinking about this, like the long term versus the short term?
This is generally, I think, probably the best example is how I approach social media, right? And so, what I'm often trying to think about is not like Mel of 2024, but I'm really thinking of Mel of like 2035, right? And what are the assets that I can create online where the effort right now it's like slow moving, but because I'm going to be creating it over 10 to 15 to 20 years, over time it starts to compound. So an example of this is like podcasting, right? And we can go into other examples as well. But the thing with podcasting is like the discoverability of podcasts, it's not all the way there, right? Because it's an audio medium. Google really likes text. And so sometimes it's really hard to figure out, like, to translate that over, unless you have really good show notes, transcript. Those are some options, right? But the thing with podcasts is, and, I would say 90 to 93% of people that have ever bought something from us say, Mel, I listened to your podcast. I loved hearing your voice. I felt like I trusted you. Then I joined your email list. I loved what you shared there. And then when you said you had something to offer, like I was in because I trusted you because I had built a relationship with you. Right. And so in terms of compounding assets, that's what I think about. So my most favorite ones are podcasting, YouTube, and I think blogging is probably the third one. Again, because they're slow, but because they can be discovered over time and the traffic just builds up over time.
You said that you've heard from people that they heard you on a podcast and they trusted you, right?
Mhm.
I think something that I appreciate about you so much is your authenticity, right? Like the way that you show up on your podcast is the same way that you show up on social media, right? Like social media can be so negative and toxic. And like we all know about the therapist Facebook groups, right? And like the arguments that people get in. And like, I'm such a believer in like you get back what you put out into the world, right? And if like you're putting out positive energy, like that's what you're going to receive in return.
Mm.
And I think that's like a great takeaway for anyone, that's listening to this or, watching on YouTube is, social media can be such a great way to develop relationships. You and I met on social media and now we've developed this great friendship, right? Can you talk a little bit about this idea of business really being about relationships, which is something, you and I have spent a lot of time talking about?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I think for many therapists, we hear the word business or marketing and we think like it's this thing that we don't know enough about, or it's about tactics or funnels or any of these things, particularly because, again, most of us have not taken business or marketing classes. So we gravitate and we hear this language and we're like, okay, I guess I should do this or do that. But I actually feel like therapists are one of the best people at business because we value authenticity, relationships, and all of these things. Actually, just recently, even this morning, my friend Jay Klaus had a LinkedIn post talking about how ultimately, like, success of a business, it all comes down to one-to-one relationships. It's something that I have to constantly remind myself because, yes, you can do a podcast like this and you can sort of build at scale, I guess, but ultimately, it does come down to these one-on-one relationships, and this is something that I know you feel. Like, I feel the immense privilege, but the power that comes when you are in a position of influence, right? Because you could say something really bad about a company or about a person. I mean, there's a decent chance it could have a significant effect on that company or that person, right? Because you said it. But realizing you have the power to do that and yet not doing it because you care about the company or the person, even though you may disagree, I think that's the thing I'm still learning. And I don't think I'm great at it, but, like, it's just something I've been thinking a lot about. But ultimately, you're right. Like, it comes down to these relationships, and especially among therapists, like, I mean, people it's word of mouth, right? Like, people know and people tell each other. So that's the other piece I think often we have to think about is not the conversations that are happening when we're present, but the conversations happening in rooms when we're absent.
I totally agree. Therapists are inherently relational people, right?
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah.
so that's why they get into the work. And, building a referral network as a therapist is all about building relationships, right? Building a community online is all about building relationships. I think there's a reason that you don't just sell courses, right? Like you have built communities that people can join. And I want to spend just a few minutes here talking about Healthcasters, which I think is like such an amazing program that you offer. Can you talk about kind of the evolution of Healthcasters to, people asking you, hey, can you teach me like how to launch a podcast? And you're having these one-on-one conversations to what it is today.
Yeah, of course. That was I call this my like failing moment product, right? So we just passed 240 therapists in this community, and
Congratulations.
yeah, thank you. It's been incredible. So I've definitely the idea was again what Mike you alluded to. There were therapists in 2015 that were reaching out asking Mel, "How are you doing this podcasting thing?" And I just thought, what would it be like if we all came together and to help and support each other? Because there's stuff that I know, but there's a ton of stuff I don't know. There's probably a ton of stuff you know, probably stuff I can help you with. And what would that look like? Healthcasters initially, and I'll share some of the mistakes along the way. I was so scared to niche down into a podcasting community for therapists that I was like, okay, we're going to call it Healthcasters because we want every healthcare provider that is vaguely interested in a podcast to be interested in this. So it doesn't matter if you're like an orthopedic surgeon or a therapist or a pharmacist, whatever it is, right? The idea was kind of there because it would be cool to build up these like networks, but 98% of the people that bought the course were therapists. And I like resisted this idea because I was like, why are not more non-therapists not buying this? Well, because probably in hindsight, I had a podcast that was speaking mainly to
Right.
therapists, right? And there was trust and all of that. So we initially started that as a 297 course. I had 8 colleagues. We ran a beta test, and it was $297. I was going to do it like a live teaching. That's definitely something I recommend if you are thinking about a course, is you should do some sort of a beta round with paying students. Those 8 students, when I was at the group practice, again, there were like, I think I was getting significantly like underpaid there, but I think I was getting like 40 something a session typically. Right. And I just thought like 297 course sale, like that is, what is that, 6 client sessions? Right. And especially had, 8 students, I was like, oh my gosh, this is kind of crazy. The evolution of it is, I went from 297 to like 497. We slowly kept kind of growing. A lot of it was like word of mouth. It wasn't doing like active marketing. We had the Facebook group, and, definitely back then the reach of Facebook groups were amazing. So people were seeing what I was posting about my podcasting journey, all of that. At some point, I decided to turn it into a membership site because I kept hearing like you need to have recurring income, recurring income. And it was a community model. So it kind of did make sense that, that there was, and we were doing like regular coaching calls and all of this stuff. So fast forward to today, a little bit before when our daughter was born, I had to take a pause from the community and the coaching calls because it was just too much to manage. So for the past like 2.5 years, we've had, actually probably a little longer than that, we've had only the course option. And recently, in the last like 3 months, we reopened the community and the coaching calls back up. And I am so grateful we did that because, one, it makes me want to work harder and create even a better course when I'm seeing like colleagues on these calls and being like, Mel, like, how are you thinking about this? Like, why did you do this? Or, it gives me data, but then it just makes me, when I see their faces, right, versus them just buying a course and going off, I never have those interactions. I think that's been wonderful. And so, where is it evolving to? I honestly, right now, I'm trying to figure that out. Do I keep it just like a one-off course model, continue the community, the coaching calls, or does it make sense of more like a premium membership model that is focused more on, building an intimate community, being able to join together, all of that kind of stuff?
For therapists who are thinking about starting a podcast, or maybe they've started a podcast, is there like one or maybe even, two things that come up in the course a lot? Whether it's like a question that folks have, or there's just like a point that you really drive home for people, that could be helpful to share with people who are listening.
I think the one big one is, don't obsess so much about gear in the first like 3 to 4 years. My setup was like $108. I was a $60 mic, a mic arm that like creaked if I like just didn't like adjust it properly, or if I like hit it on accident. And I did that for the first 5 years, when we hit 1 million downloads on the podcast. Beyond that, I think the first couple of years, the things that you should really be working on is, one, learning to ask questions, right? And I think this is sometimes therapists forget, like, podcasts are the perfect place to practice, to be a better therapist. The second thing is learning how to tell better stories online. And I feel like getting to storytelling, I feel like such a valuable skill. And that's the piece that I would say focus on. We have a free workshop as well, for that you can just sign up for at any time. That's over at sellingthecouch.com/podcasting workshop. But it basically, when I do those webinars, I was like, you know what, I'm just going to try to give as much helpful information as possible. So it's 90 minutes of just tips and strategies and all this stuff we've learned along the way.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit. I think that is such an effective marketing strategy, right? And some people may think like, why would I give away this information for free, right? Like, shouldn't I be charging? But I think it goes back to the trust that you mentioned earlier, right? And so can you talk about kind of the strategy and thinking behind offering these like free webinars and free workshops as a way to, promote the either courses or, masterminds that you offer?
To be completely honest, I didn't think deeply like you just said at the beginning. I come from, my grandparents were teachers. My dad was a law school professor, and then my mom was a nurse who taught at the nursing school. So it's like I come from 2 generations of teachers and my parents themselves, right? We moved here for education. And so I think I love teaching. I feel like it's in my veins, and I feel like there's something about when you just genuinely help someone without any sort of expectation that's just so powerful, regardless of the marketing side of it, right? And so I just oriented that way. And also, when I came here to this country, because I didn't speak the language, I mean, I remember my cousin, like one of the first conversations, he asked me, like, do I want cheese pizza? I remember the word cheese pizza. I didn't even know what cheese was. Like, cheese is not a something that we eat in South India, right? It's common in North India, but we don't really eat cheese in South India. I didn't know what pizza was. And so, like, and even like I just said, like this, right? And this actually in South India means no. And this means yes. So he just gives you a slice of pizza thinking that's what I want. But I had so many people in my life who believed in me and saw something before I saw it, you know? And so I think when I like create this stuff, it's not just like, let me think about the product down the line. Okay, now I definitely think about that stuff, but I think about, you know, if somebody's going to watch a 90-minute webinar, like they're taking time away from their family, or maybe there's like 2 client hours they could have seen, right? I want them to walk away being like, oh my gosh, I didn't waste my time. And so that's the general orientation. My thing is, I want to surprise and delight people in the content that we create.
If people are going to invest their time, invest their money that they've worked hard to earn, right?
Mhm.
Like for me, I want to give it back tenfold, right? If someone is spending an hour listening to the show, like I want them to walk away with a ton of value, right? And
Mhm.
they're like, wow, that was so worth it.
Right.
Right? Because it's such a like time is a gift, right? And people and attention is a gift too. And if someone's investing that, in you, it's almost a responsibility, like you talked about. You alluded to this earlier. You are going back into private practice, which I
Mhm.
want to talk about. So can you talk about that decision and that pull back into clinical work, and also like just how you're thinking about building your private practice intentionally?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I knew some part of me like always wanted to go back to clinical work. And I found myself, especially once we got away from like the throes of the pandemic, like really missing the work. The other thing I realized is I looked at myself in the mirror, right? I'm an Indian male psychologist living in the US. I think there has to be single digit of that, right? And the demand for mental health just generally is really high. And I just thought, especially as like a psychologist of color, there's so many needs. And so the thing I was trying to figure out was like, who do I want to work with? I think the most logical was like founders and CEOs of businesses, because that's stuff that I live and breathe, you know, with STC. I know what it's like to bootstrap. I know what it's like to build something successful. The piece that I didn't anticipate, and this is like my real full circle moment, there's been this demand of particularly like basically high achieving parents raising high achieving kids, particularly of like South Asian origin. So a lot of like high school seniors, juniors, college students, and the parents that are navigating and struggling with, you know, helping their kid who is struggling with anxiety and depression and all of these things. And that's the niche that's I've been really surprised. And I'm still so early. I mean, I haven't honestly like officially my official start date is like June, but I've done 2 workshops in the last 5 weeks specifically toward this population. So, first one was with a foundation in this community. There were basically 2 suicides of Indian students in the last year and a half, and it was an incredible opportunity to talk to, you know, 67 parents showed up on a Saturday at 11 AM, and not a single person left at the end of the hour. I shared my own story for about 15 to 20 minutes, shared a couple of tips, and then I fielded 40 straight minutes of questions. And I just thought, oh my gosh. And then one of the 67 members that were in that organization is part of a larger organization. It's an Indian cultural organization. It's the largest and the oldest in North America. So 60,000 members. And I had the incredible opportunity about 3 weeks ago to do a second workshop for them. So I don't know, Mike, like a lot of this is like, I'm trying to remember with selling the couch, we plan these things and yet unexpected things happen. And I'm trying to take that same approach to private practice. I want to see honestly between just 1 and 3 clients because right now I want to keep SDC the main thing. But I also realize there is a tremendous need and I have a tremendous passion for this intersection of high achievement and mental health because I am that kid who could have ended their life, you know, but I didn't. And somehow, but I still stuff I navigate, I mean, as an entrepreneur, I struggle with depression and anxiety. And how do I both bring a clinical lens to it as well as inform it through my personal experience as well?
How has the business side of therapy changed since pre-pandemic? I imagine a lot of therapists now are seeing clients online. Clients want to see therapists online. There's more software tools that are available. If you want to take insurance, there's startups that help you take insurance. If you want to outsource your accounting and bookkeeping, there's companies, right, like Herd that help you do that. So I'm curious, how do you think about that process of deciding, services to use or software to use as you're setting up your business?
This is one of the other big reasons why I went back into private practice because there are so many options out there. I felt like having a clinical arm to be able to and test some of these products before I recommend them because I realize the trust, right, is such an important thing. How do I think about each of these products and services? So one thing is I created an informal like roundtable of friends, colleagues that I sort of lean on if I haven't heard of a product or service. I also ask them questions like, what are sort of like, what do you use? And what do you not use? Where you think, like, I try to ask those questions just to get a better idea of how to approach it. So,
I really appreciate that. We talked months ago, right, about Herd being a sponsor of Selling the Couch. And, ultimately you told me, Mike, like, I don't use Herd, so I don't know that I can recommend it, right? Like, and that kind of ethical, position that you have of like, I don't want to endorse a product or a service that I haven't used and vetted myself. Like, I really respect that. And now you are, right, like using, Herd for your book. So, we're grateful for that as well.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think again, it goes back to that trust. I mean, to be honest, like I think with so much money now getting thrown into Silicon Valley and mental health startups, it's becoming so much harder for me just to rely on a board of advisors, right? To be a because it's just there's so many things happening and a lot of these companies have capital, right? And that's a real thing I'm navigating, right? Because they're saying like, "Hey, we want to give you 5 or 10 or 15 or I turned down a sponsor last year of that was 50,000 plus. And the reason was because I saw in our Facebook community like colleagues talking about like the experience they were having and I was like, I can't in good conscience like all money's not good money, you know? And I can't like recommend something if it's like profitable to me, but then hurts a colleague.
Well, we're getting to the end of our show, unfortunately. We have a segment that we call the footnote. And what we do is we ask you to share one key takeaway. Think about someone scribbling something in the margins of their notebook, right? What is one thing that you'd like therapists to take away from this conversation?
I would say lean into your fears because ultimately, when we're on our deathbeds, I think we'll regret the things that we didn't do versus the stuff we did do and didn't work out.
I love that. Where can folks connect with you if they're interested in learning more about Healthcasters or the other services that you offer, even to potentially hire you as a therapist, one of your first 2 to 3 clients?
Yeah, absolutely. So, uh, the main website is over at sellingthecouch.com, and my private practice website is at melvinvarghesephd.com.
Great. Thank you. We'll put that in the show notes as well. Melvin, thank you so much. This has been such an amazing conversation. I really appreciate your time today.
Mike, thank you so much I'm grateful for you and thankful for our friendship.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Herd Business School, brought to you by Herd, the financial back office for therapists. Visit the Herd Resource Hub at joinherd.com to support you in your journey as a private practice owner. And don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you in the next class.